All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Looks like we still have a few people still joining, but that's perfectly fine. We'll go ahead and get started. Today, we'll be going through our webinar around tag governance, specifically strategies for multi-brand organizations. Your presenters here today are myself. I'm Lucas Long. I'm our tag inspector product manager. So work with organizations across the globe on tag governance, monitoring, auditing, as well as architecture for data collection on a daily basis. Also presenting with me is my colleague, Chris Vaughan, who is our head of vertical for the CPG multi-brand space. And he'll be able to provide some really good recommendations and firm guidance around tag governance that you can walk away with here today. So quick overview of just what we will be walking through. So we'll start out, Chris will take us through some of the unique challenges and questions that are asked in those challenges that are faced within that multi-brand ecosystem as it relates to tag governance, data collection, standardization, all of those different items to really give us a good idea of exactly where we stand and what needs to be addressed for a solid tag governance policy given these unique struggles. I'll then walk us through what tag governance is and what tag governance means and some of the keys for governance within that multi-brand ecosystem. Once we go through some of that at a little bit more of a higher level, Chris will come in, provide some recommendations and some things that you can really take away from here and apply immediately following when it comes to your organization. So recommendations for tag governance, standardization, and enhancement of that data collection architecture for multi-brand organizations. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a summary, and I'll go through some of the keys to success, just things to really keep in mind and really prioritize as you're walking through the process and ways to ensure that you're successful as you go along that tag governance journey within your organization. So to start, I will turn it over to Chris to discuss those different unique challenges faced within organizations.
Yeah, thank you, Lucas. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. As Lucas mentioned, I am the head of vertical for our CPG and multi-brand partners here at InfoTrust. So in that role, kind of my primary responsibility is to help those complex, dynamic, multi-brand partners to develop, deploy, and measure their digital analytics strategy. As a result of this, I'm very familiar with some of those unique challenges that individual multi-brand organizations face when it comes to digital analytics and digital marketing. So as a result, what I thought is that we could start this conversation out by reviewing basically 4 unique challenges that we found that multi-brand organizations have, because I feel like these challenges kind of set the stage, if you will, for the larger multi-brand analytics and marketing discussions. So what you see on the screen here is the first kind of multi-brand challenge that we typically run across, and that's having a lack of having a centralized strategy. In general, most brands and markets are very free to develop and deploy their own digital strategies within multi-brand organizations. This can be a good thing, obviously, but also a kind of a negative thing when you talk about the input that's required from corporate teams in order to have that global standard or that global strategy. The second unique challenge is going to be the lack of visibility. So obviously with large, dynamic, global multi-brand organization, there's a lot of different silos, or there can be a lot of different silos. That lack of visibility obviously hurts corporate teams sometimes because they don't necessarily have that effective way to assess a collective performance for all of the organization's digital assets. The third unique challenge for multi-brand organizations is the lack of communication. So again, having the individual siloed departments or brands or markets can sometimes really be a detriment to the corporate team or the global organization because they're not getting inputs from those brands or markets about what's working for them and what's not working for them. And then finally, a lack of governance. And this is probably the most important one when we talk about the seriousness of the challenge. But typically, corporate teams and multi-brand organizations aren't really doing a lot of monitoring to make sure that their individual brands or markets are meeting the organization's global marketing standards. So let's dig into each one of these challenges a little deeper. And we'll start with having that lack of centralized strategies. So as I mentioned a second ago, in most multi-brand organizations, brands or markets are typically free to develop and deploy their own digital analytics or digital marketing strategies. And that's not always a bad thing, right? So markets, brands, sites, each of them will have their own individual strategic elements that need to be accounted for. But in terms of having a base level of consistency and standardization, it's still very important to have that across a number of different elements. So when you look at the screen, you'll see three different main buckets of centralized consistency and standardization, which are important for a global business. So starting with naming conventions, the naming conventions of data attributes and parameters, as well as tag names, pixel names, and the triggers associated with those. So if those aren't consistent within an organization, across the organization, it's very hard to see what type of data is being collected from site to site, which obviously makes it incredibly difficult to do those apples to apples comparisons about what's working on certain sites versus others. On the topic of data collection, we basically refer to 4 different types of data that is available in each different digital asset. So site data or app data, if we're talking about mobile apps, page or screen data, if we're talking about mobile apps, user data, and environment specific data. In most multi-brand organizations, we find that there's not a lot of consistency from market to market or from brand to brand on what types of this data is being collected or how it's being collected. Again, a real problem when you start talking about making those apples to apples comparisons with your individual reporting or visualizations. And then finally, the platforms and systems need a centralized strategy as well. If you're using different platforms in different places, it makes it extremely difficult for you to analyze the organizational performance of those systems because you don't know what's working in certain markets or for certain brands that might not be working in another. So the second unique challenge that global multi-brand organizations have is actually very closely related to the first one, and that's having a lack of visibility. So again, corporate teams typically in large organizations don't have global visibility to that digital analytics data. And there's typically 3 reasons why this happens. So the first one, there's no access to any of the data from individual brands or markets. So typically this is because a brand or a market has either forgotten or chosen not to provide access to that data to the global teams. Secondly, there's no centralized data repository. So as a result, corporate teams or the global organization has to go out to each individual brand or market's data warehouse, if you will, and get that data individually. Obviously, this is a huge issue when you talk about having hundreds or even thousands of different digital assets. Having to go and manually retrieve that data for each one typically is a large problem for multi-brand organizations. And then finally, that fragmented collection of data that I've talked about so far. So when you talk about, again, apples to apples comparison, if you have fragmented collection of data or how you're collecting the data, then obviously doing an apples to apples comparison of what's really working on your website is very difficult. Because of this lack of visibility, it means that the global team really has a limited ability to answer some key questions that are obviously important for any organization, let alone very large dynamic organizations like yours. So some of these questions include, which of the organizational assets are providing the highest ROI or return on ad spend? How are users and customers actually interacting with some of our digital assets? Are there opportunities to improve those user experiences? What sites and apps are best at fulfilling our digital goals for the organization? And then obviously the marketing vehicles that might be worth a further global investment, which are currently only being utilized on a market or brand level. So the third unique marketing and analytics challenge for multi-brand organizations is a lack of communication. So as I mentioned a second ago, the brands and markets in multi-brand organizations really rarely communicate externally of their own brand or their own market to talk about what's working and what isn't. So if you're a global multi-brand organization and you are successful, then you obviously know things are working somewhere, right? But the question is, what things are working and what lessons can you learn from individual brand or market successes which could also be applied to other brands or other markets globally. So the types of questions that you would be able to answer with this information, if there was a better communication structure, is, again, looking back at the type of marketing campaigns that are most successful, or the type of platforms that might be providing value. So if there's a platform that's being widely used for, say, e-commerce within one part of your organization, but it's not being used elsewhere, is that an opportunity because of the success that it's driven for individual brands or individual markets? And then finally, are other pieces of your business collecting data in a different way or collecting a different type of data that could also be valuable for the organization as a whole? Finally, the last challenge is probably the most critical as well as the most important. And that's that global organizations and their corporate teams typically don't do a great job of monitoring the brand and markets to make sure that they are meeting the organization's global digital analytics or digital marketing standards. So if we think about this on like a global term, without a good governance plan in place, think about what would happen in these three scenarios. So if your markets or your brands are deciding to ignore your global strategy, obviously at that point you have no cohesive data, because the data that you're collecting or that you're supposed to be collecting on these market and brand sites would be non-existent. What happens if a key stakeholder leaves your organization and gets replaced by maybe a new member of your organization, someone that doesn't understand the strategy, doesn't understand what's supposed to be going on? Again, some of that data loss takes place, which could very much harm you on a global level. And then finally, what happens if there are errors in how the global strategy is being applied? So you've got, again, that fragmented data that prevents you from getting the apples to apples comparison. So without a solid governance policy in place to help you resolve some of these issues, you can really have some serious problems. So if you look at what just popped up on the screen, the failure to adhere to some of these governance policy and global strategy regulations can have some really serious impacts. So number one, a loss to the global visibility of organizational KPIs. So again, your organization obviously is going to have KPIs and core metrics that you're wanting to measure across your entire suite of digital assets. If you don't have a governance plan in place to make sure that data is being adequately collected, how are you going to measure the organizational KPIs on a global level? Second, the deployment of competing or non-compliant tags or pixels. If there are tags or pixels or platforms that markets or brands are using which have not been compliant or not been deemed compliant at your organization, or worse, if they have been deemed harmful, for instance, because of code injection or hacking attempts or something like that, those are the types of things you have to prevent against. So if you don't have a governance model in place and you're not really monitoring your digital assets, the real risk is there for deployment of competing or non-compliant platforms within your organization. And then finally, there's always the potential, if you're not monitoring and there's no governance plan, to be collecting data or information that is in violation of local laws. So obviously a big touch point or a big story here in the last year has been the GDPR regulations in Europe. There's similar cookie consent and e-privacy laws that are in place in specific countries in Europe, specifically England. So if you're not constantly monitoring your digital assets, you don't have that governance policy in place, you don't know if your websites, if your mobile apps might be collecting some of this information, which really puts your organization, your business in violation of these local laws. And as we've seen from many of the cases with GDPR so far, it doesn't matter if the data collection is systemic across the entire organization. It really only takes one or two instances to trigger that warning and to trigger those fines or that action from individual local governments. So as you can see, tag governance for multi-brand organizations is obviously extremely critical. I want to toss it back at this point to Lucas so he can give you a bit more of a deep dive discussion into tag governance and kind of what it really means for multi-brand organizations.
Perfect. So yeah, so now we've established, what are those challenges that are being faced by you and your teams. I'm sure a lot of those things are very familiar, that you're facing on a daily basis. Now wanted to kind of dig into tag governance a bit, specifically within the context of that multi-brand ecosystem. So to start out, when we talk about tag governance and global standards and global governance, what exactly are we talking about? So at a high level, tag governance, when we're referring to that, it's just a system of tools and processes for end-to-end ownership of all marketing tags, platforms, data collection within your entire enterprise. When you're thinking about this, you can really break it down into 4 different stages or 4 different areas. So the first one is just going to be a global tag policy. This is going to be implementation and ongoing compliance with global tag standards, as well as tag policies for individual markets. So what this means is a definition of what are the approved platforms that have been vetted, that are allowed to be used and encouraged to be used across the different websites within your global ecosystem. It's important to have an overall policy in order to be able to relieve some of the pressure and some of the requirements at the individual markets and local site level. If they're having to vet all of their different suppliers, all of their different providers, all the different technology being used on their websites, apps, different digital properties, it becomes really cumbersome. You're also going to have a whole lot of data sharing agreements that are in place. Everything's going to be customized. It's way too hairy. It needs to be handled in a central area at the global level. So you can think of this as almost providing the lines within which each of the different markets and the different brands can kind of color within. So that's your global tag policy. What are the approved vendors? What can be used across the different properties within your organization? The second part is establishing a structure. And here, I'm not necessarily talking about like a data collection architecture or the structure of how data needs to be collected or even just structured and named and organized and all that. This is more about the management and the organizational structure. So defining the owners of the different platforms that are approved to be in use, defining the owners of the overall tag policy, as well as defining the owners of that different process. So who is responsible for vetting new vendors? Who is responsible for making sure the data sharing agreements are in place? Who is responsible for understanding the implementation requirements and really putting forth a global standard for each of those, as well as helping out the individual markets and brands. So assigning ownership to the different parts of the process and the different pieces of that global governance policy is really, really important. Also defining exactly how partners and agencies that might be worked with at different levels, how do they fit into the process? What are they allowed to do? Are they allowed to bring in some of their own technology? What is the process that they need to go through for that type of approval? And how exactly are you leveraging that throughout the entire organization? The third piece is extremely important. Chris mentioned it, and it's around processes and compliance. Specifically, those different regulatory, legal aspects that need to be considered when it comes to data collection, it comes to use of data, how exactly you are using that in order to be able to target users, profile users, segment everything, store, collect, the whole nine. With things such as GDPR in Europe, obviously everyone is extremely familiar with that from this past year. On the horizon, also in Europe, is the privacy directives, which is being codified and will be applied. In addition, depending upon the line of business that you're in, there's likely additional regulatory requirements around the nature of the data that can be collected, how it can be stored, how it can be used. So understanding all of those different aspects that need to be considered, and then making sure that those are top of mind as you're working through that policy and defining what is allowed behavior, what are the allowed platforms that can be happening across each of your individual websites. The final piece here is around monitoring, making sure that all that effort that you're putting into to make sure that policies are in place, processes are in place, making sure that everything's followed. So what are you doing to be able to test and make sure that individual markets, individual websites are following that global guidance, those global guidelines, How are you monitoring that? And then what does the process look like as soon as something goes awry? Every plan that's put in place is phenomenal until something breaks, and something's always going to break. How are you going to be proactive in identifying where that break is? Who is the owner that can go in and fix those things? How exactly does that process work? And that's really where that entire monitoring process comes into play. Now that we understand these 4 different areas, now I want to dig into each a little bit deeper and to really give you an understanding of how does this work well within different global organizations that we've worked with in the past. What are they doing right? What are some of the things that you can really take away? So the first area here when it comes to the global tag policy. So as mentioned before, setting that global standards, defining what is allowed, what is required from a platform and from an implementation standpoint for those different platforms. Defining that at the global level, having those different contracts in place, being able to take advantage of the scale of your organization as you're leveraging those different tools and those different platforms. The other really big key when it comes to, or a really big advantage, I guess, more so when it comes to the global standards, is being able to define what it is that should be happening so that the individual sites and the individual markets don't have to figure it out on their own. The one constant that every single brand, every single market is always going to want and need on a yearly basis, quarterly basis is more budget. They don't have enough resources in order to be able to take on everything that they want to take on, everything that they need to take on. So the more effort that you can do in one centralized place and then distribute that out so that it's easier for them to be able to select a provider for A/B testing. They already have the guidelines and they already have the direction for exactly how those things need to be put in place. The better it's going to be for the overall organization. You can take advantage of a lot of efficiencies there. So setting those global standards, again, basically drawing the lines which they can color in. At the next level, excuse me, you then have the market and the brand standards. So every single brand is going to be a little bit different. Obviously, their target market is going to be slightly different. Their offering is going to be different. So they need to have some wiggle room in which to work. So defining at that level, what are the areas that are required and then allowed within each business unit. One business unit's probably going to be different from another one in terms of their needs, in terms of potentially even the robustness and the nature of the functionality that they need on the website, the nature of the data that they need to collect, their budget for media, what they're able to do from an audience creation standpoint as well as a targeting standpoint. So you're going to have different needs for the data that needs to be collected as well as the platforms that need to be used. So at that level, working within those global guidelines, defining what it is that should be happening for each of the websites within each business unit becomes critical. That final piece at the lowest level, that local flexibility, individual websites based upon just the resources that they have available to them and the needs for that individual one specific case, giving them that flexibility to customize where needed. Where again, it starts at the high level, defining at the global what's allowed, market level defining what they should be doing, and then that local flexibility to tweak things here and there while still playing within those same rules. The one key piece here, even though that there are different needs and different things that are going to be addressed at each of the levels, is that at the global level, you need to define what that vetting and approval process looks like. Everyone should be comparing platforms, comparing partners, comparing requirements and what's allowed for data collection in the exact same process. You need to make sure that people are following the same rules, and you need to make sure that everyone is on the same page when it comes to that overall governance policy. The second piece here is that management structure. So establishing the roles and the organizational ownership. This, again, as mentioned before, comes down to process. So tag vetting and approval process. What are the approved platforms? What needs to be in use? What can be in use? The overall implementation process. Who's responsible for implementing the tags and implementing the technology on your website? How can you as a multi-brand organization, be able to leverage what one brand is doing across others. So putting those standards in place for implementation, assigning an owner to a platform, and further than that, having an owner for that actual implementation so that you can just apply those learnings across different business units. The next step within that roles and ownership is also access and then tag management. So every single organization, you're going to be working with a lot of different partners typically. You might have, a relationship with a media agency at the global level. Each individual market might have their own relationships with different agency partners or different other third-party partners in order to execute their marketing campaigns, execute their media campaigns. So what does access and what do those rules look like? To what extent can those partners customize and control things on the website as well as within that marketing mix? And it's extremely important to be able to define those roles, understand at that top level, at that global level, who these partners are, what their role is, and then also having that accountability, making sure that everyone, again, is playing by the same rules and playing within the overall governance policy. The third piece here, and why that ownership and that management structure is even more important, is around those processes and compliance. So obviously you have a lot of privacy, you have a lot of regulatory requirements. We need to be thinking about data collection within that privacy environment. So all of those are tag policy, our data collection policies, or data sharing agreements, they all need to have in mind, one, GDPR. So what are we allowed to collect? How are we allowed to use that data? What is our legal basis for processing different data points if it is classified as personal data for users within the EU? And what does that mean for other markets as well? Even if I have a website that's US focused, if I'm not geofencing that website so users from the EU can still access those properties, I still need to have GDPR in mind to be able to maintain those protections. E-privacy coming up on the horizon. That's a little bit more cookie focused. Excuse me. So making sure that those requirements, those regulations are also in mind, as well as those business-specific regulations that we mentioned before. So if you're in the financial industry, that might be one thing. If you're targeting, if your website audience or your app audience is children, that's another thing. Having those things in mind, making sure that all of those regulations and the requirements are adhered to within our policies and our processes are key. Not only to get around and not have to deal with administrative fines from the governance and from those governing bodies, but also in order to be able to maintain the reputation of your organization. Beyond that, once we understand, what are those requirements that we have to abide by, defining, mapping those requirements, making sure that everything's in place so that you can still run your campaigns, maintain the marketing needs, media needs of the organization, and setting out those different rules, defining what that structure is, and then also defining a process for approval of platforms and data collection. Set those standards, set standards to make sure that everything is compliant and everything is working within the rules of the game. The final piece here is just the monitoring. So making sure that all of the individual business units, all of the markets, all the brands are following the guidelines that are put in place, making sure that our policy is being followed and adhered to within each of the different digital assets of the organization. What that means is having regular testing and monitoring of data collection standards, identifying areas where things like personal data, PII data are being collected, identifying if those are collected, making sure that it's you have a legal basis for doing so. You're not breaking any laws or regulations in having that data collection and how you're using that data that is being collected, and then also that central management and control, having ownership, having accountability for the different platforms, so that if something goes awry and an individual website is outside of the bounds of what you have defined in your global policy, who is it that's going to step in and be able to rectify that situation, provide guidance for how those things need to be fixed. All of that goes into the ongoing monitoring piece and making sure that on that continuous basis, everything is just really adhered to and everything is followed as it's been set out within your policy. So now that we really understand the overall governance policy, what that means, the different aspects of it, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris, and so he can walk through some recommendations and some different steps for how to put this in place within a multi-branded CPG organization.
Awesome, thanks, Lucas. Yeah, so obviously Lucas now has kind of explained to you guys, detailed exactly how important governance and monitoring really is at your organization. So the next question is, how can you get your organization to a point that you can have a robust governance and monitoring process in place as well? And really it's kind of a 4-step process. So the first step is to actually centralize the global data collection for your entire organization. And the first piece of that is determining where to collect that data. Now I'm going to give you a hint here. The answer to this question is not in a spreadsheet, right? So I know everyone loves Excel and spreadsheets, but the fact is multi-brand organizations just have too many data points and business critical metrics to be able to store those in Excel. So there are really 2 options to where you can collect this data on a global level. So option 1 is a centralized digital analytics asset. Now, for those of you who might be familiar with Google Analytics, we would constitute this as what is called a roll-up property in Google Analytics. There's some different terminologies depending on the other analytics suites that we have, but just as kind of an example, this centralized digital asset is meant to collect data about all of your global assets in one single location. Obviously, this makes it great for you at the corporate or the global level to analyze and report data on all sites or all apps in your organization really, really easily. The fallback or the con to implementing a central digital analytics asset, though, is that really you can only collect data in that asset about analytics or other related marketing platforms. So anything that's not related to a specific family of analytics product probably is not going to be able to be collected alongside your analytics data for your individual sites or your individual apps. So on that note, there's a second option, and that is to utilize what is commonly known as a data warehouse. So you may have heard some examples of this type of technology in the past. They're called Google BigQuery, Amazon Redshift, Snowflake. There's a lot of different examples out there, just some of the common ones there. So the really awesome thing about data warehouses is they let you collect and analyze data other than just that analytics data. So you can store all of your relevant data from different platforms, social media platforms, YouTube, all your analytics stack platforms. All of that can flow into one single warehouse alongside things like offline conversion metrics or offline purchase data. And so that allows you to collect and analyze all that data in one single location, which can be really, really powerful for you and for large multi-brand organizations. The big issue, though, is that there's a ton of operational overhead required to get all this implemented correctly. So you really have to have a really good relationship with your IT team at your organization to figure out how to get this deployed. It typically has a really long time to get up and running. So there's a lot of planning steps, a lot of stages for deployment. And then there's also concerns, obviously, about what data gets collected and how it gets collected, making sure that it matches up with your individual organizational data collection goals. So once you've determined where to collect that data, kind of the next step is to determine who actually needs access to that data. So there's really 3 considerations here when you talk about access. So the first one is on the corporate level. So from a corporate team, who on your corporate team actually needs access to the data? And maybe it's just you that would need access to the global data, or maybe you have a team of individuals at corporate that also need that data like you do. So that's the first step, is to figure out exactly who at the corporate level needs to access that data. Secondly, are there any supporting agencies that you have that also need to access the data? Maybe there's not. Maybe you want to say, and we see this very often, through with some of our clients, we don't necessarily that you don't necessarily want agency partners to have access to global data because it just contains so much information, and it's a security concern for you or your organization. But if these agency partners and this agency support does need to have access to the data in order to provide you with ongoing reporting, ongoing visualizations, obviously that's something you're going to want to take into account. And then finally, what individual roles and permissions do people need? So a common misconception with providing access to global data is that there's really only one level of access that can be provided. So in most analytics systems, and I would actually say all of the enterprise level analytics platforms, there are multiple roles that you can give individual users that make it very difficult for even them to export data in certain situations. And so if you're really wanting to limit access to specific reports, or you're wanting to limit access to people only to be able to view data without actually editing or modifying that data in any way, all those types of permissions are there. But the key question is who needs the data in order, or who needs access to the data in order to do their day-to-day job. So once we've determined the where and the who, the next thing to determine is the what and the how. And specifically, that is what data to collect and how it should be structured. So the first piece of that is making sure that we're establishing global standards on multiple levels, or that take into account multiple levels of your organization. The first piece of that is obviously kind of what we've been talking about so far, right? You have specific organizational metrics and KPIs that are important to analyze at the global level. They're important to your organization's success. They're important to your business planning process. And so we want to make sure that on a global scale, we collect that data across all of our digital assets. But the second piece of that is to make sure we still allow individual brands or markets to maintain that analytics or tagging flexibility. The fact of the matter is each of your individual brands or markets have needs that you're not going to be able to account for on a global level. And so allowing them to carry out your global strategy on your behalf while also maintaining their own autonomy with tagging and analytics is going to be extremely important. The second piece of this is to deploy standards for all of your organizational assets. And I'm talking data collection standards here. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we have typical standardized information that applies to all websites or all apps. And they typically fall under 4 categories: site information, page information, user information, and environment information. We want to make sure that if there are pieces of information in one of these categories that would apply globally across all of your digital assets, that we're standardizing the way that we collect that data and what data is actually collected. A great example of this, let's say that you as a global organization have websites that span across 100 countries around the world. So it may be important for you in your digital analytics reporting to determine what countries are having the most success in terms of user activity or user interaction with individual websites or individual apps. So maybe one of those pieces of site information that you need to track for every single website that you own is the country that the website is associated with. Similarly, for environment type of information, it's always going to be important for you to realize in your reporting that you're looking at production websites as opposed to development or staging websites. So those environment variables are another piece that can be captured globally to ensure that in your reporting, you're really looking at the things you actually want to be looking at. So the second piece is making sure you have a common syntax across all of your data parameters and all of your attributes. This is very important because in the world of analytics and just generally in the world of computers in general, things that look similar from a naming convention standpoint don't mean the same thing. So if you as an organization want to have tracking on all of your Facebook ad campaigns, but you have one market that puts Facebook in all capital letters, and you have another market that puts Facebook in all lowercase letters. To most analytics platforms, those are two completely different things. And so you want to make sure that when you're going out and you're working with your individual markets or brands, you're being very, very clear about what your expectations are in terms of the syntax of things like marketing campaigns or data parameters that you collect on your individual digital assets. Third piece here is making sure you deploy standard tracking for key user events and key user activities across all of your assets. An example of this, for many multi-brand organizations, a key metric is obviously e-commerce transactions, the revenue generated from them, the purchases, the add to carts, those pieces of information and user activities. So if you want to analyze globally how users are completing transactions, how users are adding products to carts, you have to make sure you're tracking those in the same way on every single website. And having that standardization will make it easy for you to see in your global reporting exactly how users are interacting with individual sites, individual apps, which again will allow you to make those key business decisions at the top level of your organization. And then finally, deploying standard intuitive global naming conventions. Again, this goes back to being able to identify the assets that you have, being able to understand which assets or which tags or which pixels are deployed on individual websites or within individual apps. The final piece of the puzzle here from a standardization standpoint is making sure that you have compliant technologies for your organization. Now, this one sometimes we run into a little bit of traction on because corporate teams at the global level will say, you know, we don't feel comfortable defining the technologies that are appropriate for the entire organization. Well, the fact of the matter is there are technologies out there that have code breaches. There are technologies out there that do kind of unethical code injection into your website. And so it is important for you as a global team to understand the technologies that are being deployed across your digital assets globally. You want to make sure that as much as possible, you are limiting the exposure that your organization has to these sorts of bad actors that other markets or other brands within your organization might be deploying. So it's important to note that either you should be defining which technologies are compliant or which platforms are compliant, or at the very least, you need to be the one at the global level to define and maintain the process that markets and brands use to vet their own technologies. So giving a little bit of that control, that power back to the individual markets and brands, but still defining the process that says what makes or what really is a compliant technology within your organization. So at this point, we've laid the foundation, if you will, for our digital analytics strategy. We've determined what data will be collected, where it will be stored, and who will have access. So now it's really time to revisit the conversation that Lucas was having a few minutes ago about that critical topic of governance and how to effectively set that up within your organization. So the first step, now that we've ironed out all those details around data collection, is to establish a tag governance policy. And this really happens at two different levels. So number one, again, we've talked about it several times, is that global level of governance and that global standard. And these are tags or platforms that are both required and allowed at the global level. So again, those key metrics, what tags, what are you as an organization using to run marketing campaigns globally? Those are the things that fit into this bucket. But we also have to take into account those local variables as well. So are there specific tags or platforms that are required or need to be allowed at a local, a brand, a market level? Say if you know, one situation that is commonly referenced in this area is with China, right? So China has very specific rules and regulations about what types of platforms can be deployed on websites there. And so if your business is one that that actively works with the Chinese market, you're going to have to make some different considerations at the local level for tagging and platforms than you would with some of your other markets. Again, the key though for both of these buckets is to ensure that you are globally defining the vetting and approval process for any tags or any platforms to make sure that even if you're not explicitly approving them yourself, you at least are defining the process that allows them to be approved by an individual market or brand. So the second piece of this is to make sure we're standardizing the data structure and nomenclature. So the questions here are around the types of data we can and will collect, how that data will be collected, and then as Lucas was mentioning a few minutes ago, what type of data is not compliant within our organization, or what type of data violates those local or the regional laws. These questions are really, really important, especially when it comes to third-party marketing tags. So up until now, as we talked through step 1 and step 2, standardizing your data collection, we talked a lot about how individual analytics tags or data collection within your organization might be happening. But again, it's important to also keep in mind those third-party tags, the website tags for marketing organizations outside of your own, which may not previously have been accounted for with your data collection strategy. If those tags are being set up in a way that collect data that is in violation of a local or regional law, or those tags are set up in a way that, again, has some sort of code injection or explicit code in them, it can reflect obviously very negatively on you as an organization. Again, it only takes one bad apple, and as a large multi-brand organization, everyone's kind of gunning for you, right? You can't take that PR hit because you decided not to standardize the data structure for the tags that you have on your site. Once you have those two pieces in place, now you're ready to tackle the ongoing governance and monitoring for all of your digital assets. And really, this boils down to one point: doing regular checks of your organizational assets to ensure that they are compliant with your global and local strategies. And so you're probably thinking to yourself, hey, you know, I'm on a corporate team, I'm at a large organization. How on earth could I possibly do regular checks of all my organizational assets? I have hundreds, I have thousands of different assets globally. How can I do all of these regular checks? So my advice there would be to consider some sort of an enterprise level tag auditing or monitoring platform. So Tag Inspector, InfoTrust product is one of these. With some of these enterprise level auditing and monitoring platforms like Tag Inspector, you get this automated monitoring. So you don't have to go out there and physically do the monitoring yourself time after time after time. You can set up this automated monitoring that for all of your organizational assets, and then once that's set up, you can get yourself real-time alerts or real-time emails around the compliance of your digital assets. So if you do have, let's say, a new website that gets launched in Austria, this Austrian site gets set up, and your tag monitoring, tag auditing solution alerts you that that website is collecting data that is in violation of GDPR. Obviously, that is something you need to fix very, very quickly because the fines related to that are incredibly high. So as a result, a tag auditing, a tag monitoring solution at the enterprise level can really help you identify those problems globally very quickly and very efficiently. So we've gone through the first 3 steps of the process. The last step is really having this continuous improvement to the entire process. So the fact of the matter is, successful digital analytics, successful tag governance, it requires ongoing effort from you. It can't be a set it and forget it strategy. And that covers a number of different areas. So first, we need to make sure that there is solid documentation of your global standards and your processes. That documentation needs to be in place, and it needs to be readily accessible and delivered to individual stakeholders within your individual markets and brands. Secondly, make sure you're having ongoing bi-directional communication with your brands and markets. It can't just be a top-down communication approach. You also have to be getting feedback from your markets, from your brands, to find out what's working and what's not. Comprehensive training is really important, both for internal teams and your individual stakeholders at each brand and market. When you start talking about new people coming on board, start talking about turnover, this training becomes even more important because you want to make sure everyone understands the standards, that everybody knows what the rules are. Doing these regular trainings with those teams ensures that every member of your organization is aligned with the global data collection strategy, which gives you the information you need to make really critical business decisions. Fourth, and maybe most importantly, we talked about this just a second ago, but you really have to be dedicated to quickly actioning any issues that are found during your tag monitoring. So as I mentioned a second ago, a tool like Tag Inspector can give you real-time alerts anytime there's a critical issue found on one of your digital assets. If you get that alert and then just completely ignore it, obviously you're leaving yourself and your organization open to a lot of problems. So you have to make sure, if you're going to go forward with a robust tag governance strategy, you have to action issues immediately that are in violation of that strategy. And fourth, make sure that this is an ongoing process. Make sure you're making modifications to the process as you go along, as you get feedback from brands, from markets, and constantly adapt your process and your strategy to reflect your organization's needs and their updated concerns.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris, for walking through those different recommendations and some of those actionable items for what it means and what needs to be put in place for the overall tag governance policy and how multi-brand organizations can deal with that. The last thing I just want to quickly cover here, it's a little bit of a summary of some of the items that we have covered already, but some of the keys to success and really things to keep in mind to make sure that you're successful in implementing an overall tag governance policy within your organization, as well as maintaining those standards on an ongoing basis. The number one thing here, and it's highlighted on the slide for a reason, is have a vision of what the end result will look like. Far too often we come in and start working with organizations and everything's piecemeal. They know what they want to do for one individual initiative or one individual issue, but there's no overall vision for what the end result with a perfect, sunny, bright overall governance policy will look like. Have a vision, at least from a high level, of what that looks like. You have your policy in place, you have the different processes for X, Y, Z in order to be able to address any issues, in order to approve new platforms, in order to really get the most out of the data and standardize that data collection across all of your global properties. Number two, make sure that you have ownership of those standards and processes. It's one thing to go through the exercise of just putting everything in place, making sure that you have the documentation, and then putting it aside, throwing it on a wiki on your internal ticketing system or whatever it may have at your organization. It's a whole other thing to have ongoing ownership and being proactive with it, making sure that everything is followed, making those continuous improvements like Chris had mentioned, to really ensure that everything is working as expected and is optimal for your organization. Number three, that organized and the structured data is critical. We'll quickly cover it here at the very end, but when it comes to the maturity of your digital organization, if you don't have structured data, you can never get to a point where, one, you can never even do apples-to-apples comparisons within one given platform across different sites, different markets, different brands, which should be enough. But number two, you can never get to a point where you can really get to integration across different platforms and really being able to leverage your entire digital marketing, digital media stack as a result of not having structured data. So organize it, define what it needs to look like, make sure it's in place across all the different properties that are within your organization. Number four, make sure that you're considering time considerations and planning. All of this isn't going to happen in one day. It's not all going to happen in one big push next quarter. You need to have that vision, break it down into individual steps, and really build upon that. So start at that global level, defining those policies, really put those processes in place, and then work down. Get more granular with it. What are the requirements within each of the individual platforms? What is that data structure? How can you set that up within a data layer or just an object on all pages to make sure that everything is the same? How is your front end working with the back end in order to be able to get that organized and structured data to be actionable and collectible by those different platforms that are running on your properties? Once you get through those different areas, so once you have that standard data just architecture in place, once you have standardization around the different platforms in use, that's when you can get in and start using some automation and really save a lot of time, especially in a multi-brand environment, and being able to make changes and make improvements and make deployments across the entire global ecosystem within hours as opposed to weeks or months. And then finally, the final key to success, and we can't hammer it home enough, monitoring. Making sure that everything is being adhered to, making sure that your standards are being followed across each individual business unit. And as soon as something is outside of the bounds of what should be happening, making sure that you're really addressing it there. So those are the 6 keys to success, things to really focus on. And with that, we can have a few minutes here to kind of turn it over. Well, the last thing I just want to leave you with before we jump into questions is really looking at that overall activation journey. So being a little bit self-aware within the organization, understanding where you are. How we like to typically visualize this with organizations that we're working with, it's really a crawl, walk, run type of a progression. So when it comes to governance, step 1 is just that digital architecture and the data governance, implementing that global technology and data strategy, putting that governance process in place, and then getting some automation starting to work so that you can really start to take advantage of that global scale. Finally, once you have all of that in place, you have those standards, you have that structure or organization, you then get to that walk stage where you're starting to get into some of those platform integrations and business insights. So like I mentioned, really being able to activate the value of your entire marketing technology stack. You can only get there once you have that standard organized data structure, as well as the standards for the platforms that are in use. Making sure that they're able to talk and work with each other. At that point, you can start integrating across platforms, start doing a lot of online, offline, and really bringing everything that you're collecting, everything that you're doing together in one place in order to be able to take action on those different data points that are being collected. The other aspect within this walk stage is, and what makes it a lot easier when it comes to activating that entire marketing technology stack, is having a platform-centric strategy. What is most important to your organization? What are you really leveraging? What are you using the most? And then building out from that. That might be, supplier or, like a Google-centric strategy, for example, really using everything within their ecosystem. Could be, elsewhere for other types of platforms. But defining what's most important and then working and building on top of that. Once you have all these things in place, you can get to that run stage where you're really starting to no longer be reactionary with the data that's collected and just understanding what's happening now, but you can start using everything in order to be able to forecast, get predictive, and really get proactive and start getting ahead of the curve. So have some self-awareness, understand where you are in the spectrum, be able to prioritize the different activities within it, and you will get to that point where you have that full tag governance bliss, have a policy process in place, and are really able to leverage and take action on all that data that's being collected across your hundreds, thousands of different properties. With that, I think that's everything that we have for you all today. Thank you all very, very much for joining. As always, webinar is recorded. We'll send out the slides as well as a recording for you following the webinar. Let us know if you have any questions. If reach out to us, don't hesitate to reach out to us. As mentioned before, we work with hundreds of organizations globally, some of the largest multi-brand organizations in the world, helping them really put these policies, processes in place. So anything that we can do to help, never hesitate, reach out. And yeah, we hope to see you on future webinars. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.